Sketching outside is the ultimate in freeing experiences until you start packing, and then you end up with a bag over one shoulder, a bag over the other shoulder, all of your pockets full, a raincoat just in case, and a sun hat. So surely there has to be a better way. Surely there has to be a way that we can cut down on all of this equipment. You're joining me today in Lower Slaughter. Now, forgive the rather scary name. It's actually an absolute gem of a Cotswold village. It's packed with tourists most of the time, but I'm here nice and early on a slightly cloudy Monday. So we have the run of the village to ourselves to explore this amazing architecture, this beautiful river. And of course, what I'd love to do is show you how I'm going to use a very small sketching setup to sketch one of the absolutely famous, beautiful landmarks, which is, of course, the old mill, the old water mill in Lower Slaughter. When we're trying to paint and sketch outside, sketching loose is a really lovely way to make it achievable. And one of the things I always say is to sketch loose, use a big brush, loads of water. But what if you can't? Well, today I'm putting my own advice to the test with this rather lovely little painting set. So this is a tiny painting set. The whole thing is about the size of a credit card. I have, I think, 11 colours in there. 11 slightly experimental colours. And the mixing room is tiny, the colours are tiny. So, is it possible to actually sketch in a really loose style outside, against the odds, with the weather, and use something this tiny? Well, let's see. This set I bought from Etsy, and it is not a sponsored post. It is actually inspired by an amazing artist I had join me on a weekend course called Ella, who had these beautiful little sketching palettes, and I thought, let's try it, let's have a go myself. You can see it just fits together with simple magnets, and it clips to your page, and we can shake it and it doesn't fall off. You might clip this to a block like I have, or you can clip it to a sketchbook, which is probably the more normal way to do it. And like that, we're ready to sketch. Now, the scene that I'm sketching, you can see in front of me, it is the old watermill. That's why we've got how you choose to start a sketch when you're outside, or watery noises behind us, is very personal, and it might actually change day to day. For me today, I'm a bit intimidated by how I'm getting the watermill, the actual wheel down. So that's why I've started with the wheel itself. That's also our focal point, and that's the bit I want to capture, to get as our sort of main focal point. There's lots of contrast there, there's lots of shadows, there's lots of textures, and I want that nicely seated on the page, and everything else can flow out. What I don't want to do is spend too long sketching that one little bit before moving on. We're doing a loose sketch outside. The weather might change, or something might change that means I have to move on. So if I spend too long on one bit, I might never get a scene I'm happy with. So I move on, and this is where you can actually find one slight flaw with my sketching setup, where I've put my water pot, which we'll be looking into later, of course, when we get the brush out. Well, it's kind of where my chimney wants to be. So we do have to recognise, even though I must say I love using this sketching setup and I will be using it more, there are downsides. Even now, get to the right hand side of the page and I might want to extend the image over a bit, but it just so happens that my palette is there. So again, there are pros to this which we're going to be talking about, apart from the obvious pro that it's cute, small, lightweight, fits in your pocket. But there are cons which you're already seeing emerge on the page. Nonetheless, these are the kind of things which happen when you're outside. Nothing is perfect, so we adapt. And we just change our expectations of what we're achieving. And in the end, you'll see actually this turns into a rather lovely sketch with a more controlled proportions than it might otherwise have been. I continue with my normal process, sort of feeling the continuous lines a little bit, really just trying to get shapes on the page, and hopefully you can see what I mean by those shapes. There's rectangles, triangles, just big areas that I'm building on the page. I also like to focus on the top line of an image first before bringing in the details below. One thing I quite enjoyed, it was very close to me, it's only a few metres away, was this little light which attaches to a beautiful cottage The cottage overlooks this amazing watermill, and I just felt that would make a nice edge. Now, I had planned to make more of the cottage, but again, look where that palette is. I can't do any more to the cottage, so just develop it more as a framing element, and that's why I put a bit more effort into the light. Underneath, we can then start building in suggestions of texture and detail. There's lots of little windows, there's lots of lovely bricks here. I'm not sure if these are actually Cotswold stone or not. Some elements certainly are Cotswold stone and some probably aren't. Cotswold stone being that lovely sandy stone, real texture, and really a beautiful part of all the villages in the Cotswolds, of course. But nonetheless, lovely textures, going round, capturing little shapes now, little shapes of windows, using continuous line elements, just build up a feel for the scene. Having got the framing element on the right, I felt the tree on the left could be a slightly asymmetric framing element on the left, which is why I've given that big sort of circular shape on the top. And then we can go back and start working into what I felt was going to be the focal point, the water wheel and the contrast around it. And I think now, happy with the shapes, it's time to start adding those little hatched marks, those little areas of contrast. Now, something you might be able to notice, if you look at my leg on the bottom right of the screen, you'll notice some water drops. So yes, it has started raining. Outside plans always go awry. So this is where I sort of just jump ahead and go, right, if it's raining, I don't know how long I've got until it starts really raining, and you can see the rain collecting on my legs. So go quicker with the pen and really start adding that bold contrast. Contrast is important, I think, in sketching and painting to create interest. We can do it with watercolours, but it takes layers and layers. Or we can do it with our pen, with hatching, with blotting in of ink. So that is why suddenly I'm moving a bit quicker, moving ahead with the process and adding more ink on the page in a more sort of scribbly fashion. As before, I can't stress that every painting setup has its disadvantages. And if you are taking a super lightweight painting setup out with you, you're not going to have an umbrella, you're not going to have a way of covering yourself, and you might just have to deal with the elements and be a bit looser, more creative with how you're sketching. Nonetheless, I'm pleased with how this is going. I think it's got a real quirky feel for the place, and the last little elements are just coming together with the sort of railing details. And like that, we're pretty much ready to move on and really start exploring this exciting little palette. One major issue that I have with tiny setups is often it necessitates the use of a water brush. And whilst water brushes are okay, they just are not as good as using a proper brush. Now, instead of that, with this tiny setup, you can add a tiny little water pot, which is what actually came with the set for me. And that means I can use my travel brushes. And travel brushes are essentially just as lovely as normal brushes. This is an Escoda Versatile size 10 round brush. And you can see that that means, yes, we can sketch loose. Maybe not quite with the same freedom, but notice how this tiny mixing area, half the size of a credit card, is so fluid that with the touches of water and using our paint in a sort of sensible manner, not flooding the mixing area, we can actually start creating these loose, varied washes. The page is already fairly full of loose and again varied colours, which is exactly what I'm after. A big challenge in this scene is going to be really getting that contrast and the feel of the reflections into the river. The only way that I'm going to manage that is if we can truly paint wet on wet, and that again requires loose washes, it requires enough water. So being able to actually mix the colours, use a proper brush and have all of your stuff in this tiny confined area in front of you. I was amazed, actually, absolutely amazed at how well it did function and how I was able to produce the effects I wanted to produce on the page. So already we are meeting some of these lovely benefits, some of these big benefits to this setup. No, it's not the same as sketching in the studio, or not even the same as sketching with my big Etcher pad sat in front of me and all the tools, the big mixing area, everything I'm used to. But it is very good. It's far more usable than I was expecting it to be, especially being able to just use brushes that I'm comfortable with. You can see that here, this little touch of colour got a bit rich on me, but look how I touch it in there. And it's soft, and that's because there's enough water on the page, and it's because there's enough water in the brush. These things don't happen with water brushes. My focus now is in trying to continue to capture the lovely textures and the variation in colour that sort of infuses through all of these bricks. Next to it we have some slightly more murky browns and brighter yellows, which again we can mix in our tiny little area. One slight downside here is that I don't have a big area to mix. You can see that it's starting to risk everything blurring together, at which point I'm going to end up with a kind of neutral or murky mix. Not the end of the world, but not quite ideal for what we're trying to achieve. And so we just need to be wary, especially if I added this blue into that mixing area, I might end up with just neutrals everywhere. And now we are moving on to the sort of third stage of my normal process. And it's amazing that with a tiny setup like this, I can actually proceed in my normal processes. This is what I would call bold colours. You can see we've got the soft wash underneath. Now we're adding much richer, deeper, more vibrant tones on top. And this is working really well. Again, it's just the ability to use a normal brush. That's the power of the setup I've got in front of me here. Clipping things onto the page, accepting that's a fairly significant limitation, at least with just using it in such a lightweight manner. But being able to come in with my normal brush is letting me layer, letting me create the textures I'm used to, and not giving you another limitation of that kind of nylon water brush. And the colours are layering up really nicely. Now, we talked quite a bit about the difficulties there of having a small mixing area, and you can kind of see that mixing area now taking on those very neutral feeling colours. There's some rich tones, but there's also some neutral areas. One thing I'd certainly say is important therefore to bring with you with this setup is just some tissue. And like magic, the mixing area is clear again. And I probably should have done that a little bit earlier because things were just getting a bit murky. But the thing which prompted me to do it was I decided I wanted something a bit bolder, more brash. Got out my smaller brush. This is a size 6 black velvet by Silver Brush, round brush. And I can now just start again, pick out bolder, more raw colours, mixing again the same kind of things I've been mixing the whole time, but taking on a more punchy and expressive feel, I guess, to the colours. And this is where, again, look, using a real brush, it lets us paint wet on wet in a controlled manner. And I'm starting to build in those reflections, the contrast, the focal point can develop a little bit, all without it feeling overworked, without it feeling too busy, without flooding the page with water. I dare say I should call this part, since I've been using this small brush, really the finishing touches. But certainly now we're on to the finishing touches, adding those boldest elements of contrast and also adding the more expressive elements, or trying to build out the foreground with more suggestions of detail. The other fun bit, of course, that we can start adding in are some little splashes. We have big elements of white on the page, so using touches of the colours we've already used plenty of is a really nice way just to make those white elements feel a part of the scene without sort of trying to be too clever, without trying to paint everything when we are battling the elements. You can actually see my trousers are dry now. The weather came, it went, it came back briefly and then it went away, which is why we're able to continue to experiment. I wanted to just finish the finishing touches by taking away that little water pot and seeing if I could extend the chimney. Now, I'm not sure if this is a good idea or not, because it's always a little bit risky trying to add lines on top of already present lines in colour and make it feel like it was really part of the same process. But I think it worked all right. I scrubbed the colours together so we didn't have too much of a hard edge. I added some splashes and some other slightly more busy colours underneath just to cover up the busyness which inevitably developed from me trying to patchwork together my piece of art. But before long, a few extra shadows here and there, a couple of suggestions of details, and we can call this piece done. Just show you it again with it sort of in front of the mill. Actually works quite well. It's not bad. The proportions are all right. The colours are obviously a little expressive, but nice sense of light, nice sense of shadow, and really I enjoyed myself. Would I paint with this setup again? Absolutely, and I'm absolutely certain I'll be bringing you some more videos using it. Reminder, there's a little blog post down below where I'll talk about all the mixes I'm using, the colours, where to get this set up, and a little bit more detail about how I felt. Join me in the next video as well. Don't forget to leave a comment, like and subscribe.